Mike and his buddy Chris had been planning this fishing trip for months. A week at Lake Evergreen, just the two of them, their boats, and the promise of record-breaking catches. They'd heard rumors about the lake, fish bigger than anyone had seen before, but chalked it up to typical fishermen's tales. The first few days were great. The weather was perfect, the beers were cold, and they even managed to reel in a few decent-sized bass. But on the fourth day, things started to feel off. It began with the silence. No birds, no insects buzzing, just the lapping of water against their boats. Chris joked about it being the calm before a storm, but the sky remained clear. Then their fish finder started acting up. It showed massive shapes moving beneath them, far larger than any fish should be. Mike suggested it was probably just a school of smaller fish clustered together. That night they heard splashing, big splashing. When they shone their flashlights on the water, they caught glimpses of something huge just beneath the surface. Probably a beaver, Chris said, not sounding convinced. The next morning, they found their stringer of fish gone. The rope had been cleanly cut. They blamed it on raccoons, but both men felt uneasy. As they headed out on the lake, Mike noticed something in the water. A flash of scales, but not like any fish he'd seen before. It was almost iridescent. Chris saw it too, and they spent the day debating what it could be. A new species? Some kind of mutation? That evening, as they sat by their campfire, a park ranger stopped by. He seemed on edge, asking if they'd seen anything unusual. When they mentioned the weird sightings, his face went pale. He warned them to pack up and leave first thing in the morning. Wouldn't give a reason, just said it wasn't safe. Mike and Chris were spooked but decided to stay. They'd paid for the week, after all. But sleep didn't come easy that night. The splashing was louder, closer. At one point, Mike could have sworn he heard something large moving around their campsite. Dawn broke, and with it came a heavy mist on the lake. They decided to get one last trip in before packing up. As they paddled out, the fog grew thicker. Soon they could barely see each other, let alone the shore. That's when they heard it. A sound like a giant inhale, followed by bubbles breaking the surface all around them. Their boats rocked violently. As the mist cleared, they found themselves in the middle of the lake. But the water, it was moving, pulsing. The entire lake surface rippled like it was breathing. Suddenly, something burst from the water between their boats. A massive serpentine form covered in those iridescent scales. But it wasn't a fish. It had arms, ending in webbed claws, and eyes. Intelligent, ancient eyes that fixed right on them. As the creature rose higher, revealing more of its impossible form, Mike and Chris realized the horrifying truth. They hadn't come to fish in this lake. They'd come as bait. Story 2. Jake and his daughter Emma had been planning their fishing trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a chance for them to bond away from the bustle of their everyday lives. They chose a remote lake known for its serene environment and plentiful fish, nestled deep in the woods. The first couple of days were perfect. They caught several fish, enjoyed campfire meals, and shared stories. But on the third day, everything changed. Jake woke up early to find Emma already by the lake, casting her line. As he approached, he noticed something odd. The lake's surface seemed darker, almost oily. When he asked Emma if she noticed anything strange, she shrugged. Just a weird reflection, I guess. Later that morning, their lines started tangling with strange objects. At first, it was old fishing nets and bits of clothing. Then, Jake reeled in something that made his stomach churn, a child's shoe covered in muck. They decided to move to a different spot, hoping for better luck. The new location wasn't any better. Emma's lines snagged on something heavy. She struggled to pull it up, and when it finally broke the surface, they were horrified. It was a rusted metal box, tightly sealed. They pried it open with a rock, revealing old waterlogged photographs of people they didn't recognize, all staring directly at the camera with expressions of terror. That night, they couldn't shake the unease. As they sat by the fire, Jake noticed the forest had gone silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet. Emma suggested they pack up and leave in the morning. Jake agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Just before dawn, Jake woke to the sound of splashing. He grabbed a flashlight and headed towards the lake, finding Emma already there, staring at something in the water. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. Jake followed her gaze and saw it, a figure standing in the shallows, motionless, watching them. He grabbed Emma's arm and they ran back to their tent. They decided to leave immediately. As they packed, they heard more splashing, followed by muffled voices, though they saw no one. They hurriedly loaded their gear into the car and sped off, the eerie quiet of the forest pressing in on them. Days later, back home, Jake couldn't stop thinking about what they'd seen. He began researching the lake's history and discovered something chilling. The lake was notorious for disappearances. Dozens of people had gone missing over the years, their bodies never found. Determined to find answers, Jake returned to the lake alone, despite Emma's protests. As he reached the lake's edge, the air felt heavy. He walked to the spot where they had seen the figure. The water was still, unnervingly so. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. Turning slowly, he saw figures emerging from the trees, pale and silent, their eyes locked on him. They were the people from the photographs, unchanged by time. As they approached, Jake realized with a sinking heart that the lake was a trap, a lure for the unsuspecting. The figures reached out, and Jake's vision blurred. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the lake, now eerily calm, swallowing him whole. Back home, Emma waited for her father's return, unaware of the lake's secret and the fate that awaited anyone who ventured too close. Story 3. Mark had always dreamed of catching the big one. When he heard about a fishing contest at Stillwater Reservoir with a huge cash prize, he knew he had to enter. The catch? Participants had to fish at night. Arriving at the reservoir, Mark was surprised by the number of competitors. The air buzzed with excitement as everyone set up their gear. As darkness fell, Mark found a quiet spot away from the crowd. The night was still, the water like black glass. His line cast out with a satisfying plop. Hours passed without a bite. Mark was about to call it quits when his line suddenly went taut. This was it. The fight was intense. Whatever he'd hooked was strong. As Mark reeled it in, he noticed other anglers having similar luck. Shouts of triumph echoed across the water. Finally, Mark's catch breached the surface, but in the beam of his headlamp, he realized it wasn't a fish. It was a hand, a human hand gripping his lure. Horrified, Mark dropped his rod. All around, anglers were pulling up similar, grotesque catches, arms, legs, even heads, all perfectly preserved. Panic spread through the crowd. In the chaos, Mark noticed men in dark uniforms emerging from the trees, herding the frightened anglers. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Remain calm. You've participated in a classified recovery operation. What you've found are victims of a plane crash from 30 years ago. Your silence is mandatory." Mark's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The contest was a ruse. They were never meant to catch fish. The government had used them to recover evidence they couldn't explain away. As he was led to a debriefing area, Mark understood the real horror. He was now part of a secret he never asked for, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The big catch he dreamed of had turned into a nightmare he could never escape. Like the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more horror stories.